slides to the investment on the left. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Up better now. So on hand over to you. Do you make your remarks? I'll be the first speaker.
Yeah, but you want me to call on the others to speak or?
No, I'm saying I'll speak first, then the others. Order, yeah. I'll speak first, then Satish, then Dulat, then Sushant.
Okay, so after welcome
So
remarks.
basically, I call the house to order, hand over to you, you make your remarks, and then call me as the first speaker.
Okay.
Shall I start? Can I start?
Yeah, sure.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to welcome you on behalf of the India International Center. My name is Uday Bhaskar. And before we start, can I make the familiar request to all of you? Please put your phones on silent, preferably on flight mode. And a couple of occasions we realized that if you have an alarm and you haven't switched the alarm off, despite flight mode, despite silent mode, it will still ring. So this is just, additional jankari about how phones have acquired autonomy. So that's the first. A lot of people have sent messages saying that they are stuck in different parts of Gurgaon and Noida and would be on their way, but notwithstanding, perhaps we should start. Shyam sir, maybe start or wait for a few minutes? Start the proceedings.
Please.
Again, good evening. Welcome to this evening's panel discussion on Kargil at 25. As all of you are aware, this is a war that was fought in the summer of 1999. And in the last 3 to 4 months, in the run-up to the 25th anniversary, there has been a lot of focus on different aspects of the Kargil war. So we felt it would be appropriate perhaps to spend a little time looking at different aspects, and that really is the aim and objective. To be able to look at that war and maybe come up with a few observations about things that may have been missed in the course of the last few years, particularly in the early years after that war had ended. That having been said, let me introduce our panel for this evening. We're very glad to have, a very, very eminent panel, a word that is often used, but I think it is burnished today. I have great pleasure in introducing 3 very well-known domain experts in their own way. We have Lieutenant General Satish Nambiar, very familiar military man, commissioned in the MLI, Maratha Light Infantry. More recently, before he retired, he was the force commander and the head of mission for the United Nations Protection Force in Yugoslavia in 92-93. Subsequently, he retired as the Deputy Chief of Army Staff. And when we had our most, I would say, robust engagement, he was the director of the USI and has contributed enormously, I think, to the discourse in India about matters military. And as recently as 2004-05, he was the chairman of the Honors Committee for the Kargil War. So that gives him a perspective that I think very few people in the military have. Along with him, we have Mr. Dulat. A.S. Dulat is a familiar name. You Google him, you'll get roughly about 1 mile of references. And that is because of his last 2 books, where in lighter vein, people on social media have called him the rock star of the spy world. But again, more seriously, Mr. Dulat, distinguished IPS officer, went into the agencies. One of the few people that I can recall who at a very difficult time headed both the IB, the Intelligence Bureau, and then the R&AW. And when Mr. Vajpayee was Prime Minister, he had a particularly difficult charge. And then he was the advisor in J&K and knows, as I said, a few things. But it's a case of the man who knows too much. That for you is A.S. Dulat. but we'll request him to talk to us today about the intelligence dimension of this war, because that's been one of the central features, the intelligence lapses that led to Kargil. And to close the loop, as it were, we have Sushant Singh, Professor Sushant Singh, currently a lecturer at the Yale University. Prior to that, he's been a journalist of eminence. He was with the Indian Express, deputy editor, also now with the Caravan. And for the record, Army sapper, right, Sushant?
Yeah,
Almost 20 years, Madras sapper. He would provide certain aspects about the media and military history and how we see Kargil in a more theoretical academic context. I'd like to thank Ambassador Shyam Saran, President of the India International Center, for agreeing to steer the proceedings and chair the session. And before I hand over to him, I would like to particularly acknowledge the presence here this evening of some of the veterans of that war. I can recognize a few, but not all of them. We have Brigadier Yadav, One Bihar. Round of applause. They did a great job. We also have the 1st 11 Gorkhas, Colonel Asthana. I'm not sure if I missed anyone else, but I thought that any Kargil veteran, we'd particularly like to acknowledge your contribution in that war. So on that note, I'll request Ambassador Shyam Saran to do the proceedings. Sir?
Thank you very much, Uday, and thank you very much for taking the initiative to organize this very special meeting to mark 25 years of Kargil. It is always good to reflect back on experiences that we have been through, and to also look at what lessons we can learn from those experiences. I would particularly want to say that, some of the reporting which you see in the press is very much, who was responsible, people pointing fingers at each other. I do not think that that's a very, productive exercise. But much more productive is what we hope to be able to do this evening, which is to see what may have worked with respect to handling this crisis and what did not work. Because that is what, in handling situations of this kind would be more useful to us going forward. Now, my perspective is essentially of someone who was in the National Security Advisory Board, first as a member and then as chairman. And I was also involved in the task force on security, which was headed by Shri Naresh Chandra ji, another great veteran, both civil service as well as on security issues. And just 3 or 4 points I would like to make. One is that, what is perhaps very important to note is the courage which was shown by the Vajpayee government to actually agree to turn the spotlight back on the government itself. And that in India is a rare thing for the government to open itself out to outside scrutiny, bringing in experts from outside. Of course, Shri K. Subramaniam was chairing the Kargil Review Committee, and we had several experts from several fields who really went into very great detail as to how something like this could have happened and what are the lessons to be learned. So this is the first point I would like to make, is that it's extremely important, particularly in a democracy where accountability is such an important issue, such an important quality, I would say, that the willingness of government, even if maybe there might be some embarrassing details which may come out, for the government to open itself out to scrutiny. Sadly, this was not followed with subsequent events. So even with the task force on security, Shri Naresh Chandra was very keen that whatever papers we had, whatever conclusions we came to, they should also be open to public debate. Let people see what Are there lacunae in our security, establishment? Kargil committee report implementation. How much has been implemented? How much has not been implemented? These kind of issues which were actually addressed by the task force. Unfortunately, when the time came to really open this out, the government said it's better that we keep it amongst ourselves. And that's the story with several other incidents which have taken place, whether it is Pathankot or whether it is Uri. In each case, the preference has been to have a more confidential kind of accounting, a more in-house kind of accounting, rather than have the courage to really open this out to open scrutiny. So I think this is something which to me is a very important learning, that we should perhaps have some kind of a institutionalized mechanism which, I wouldn't say compel, but which persuades maybe governments to actually, turn the spotlight on yourself, because that is how you can improve in the future. That is one point that I would like to make. The second point that I would like to make is, I also did a study on crisis management in India, looking at how various kinds of crises were managed over a period of time. And one of the important learnings that I came across was that, it is amazing how for most situations that you might face, there are actually quite very detailed drills which are already laid down. How you should actually react to any kind of situation which arises. Who has what responsibility? We have a crisis management group under the cabinet secretary. He does not need anybody's sanction to actually convene that crisis management group. I know because I worked together with that group, and I was part of that group when we had, the Iraq hostage crisis, if some of you might remember, when several of our, nationals were, kidnapped, in doing that stretch between Iraq and Kuwait. We used to meet every day. The cabinet secretary was convened this meeting. We had every important component of the government represented at those meetings. So if it was, for example, there was a need for, how do we counsel the families of the hostages? Are there resources available for us to be able to do that? Television crews were going to those villages and saying to the parents or to their relatives, "Aapko nahi lagta hai ki sarkar aapke liye kuch nahi kar rahi hai?" That kind of almost inviting them to say nasty things about the government. How do we control that? The narrative control, which becomes very important. Without actually being not understanding the kind of sense of anxiety that those families were going through. You have to take that into account. We finally had, the Minister of State for External Affairs every morning, every evening, even if we had nothing to say, he would go in front of the media and say what the current status was. So I used to call it a feeding the sharks, every day. And that helped us really manage the situation. So what I'm trying to say is that there are very clearly laid down drills of the government of India to deal with various kinds, a whole spectrum of situations, crisis situations. If you followed those drills, actually, you would actually be able to handle many of these situations quite well. So that is the second point I would like to make. The third point I would like to make is that there is inevitably a tendency or a compulsion on the part of governments to control the political narrative. And therefore, even if there are drills which are laid down, mostly we then fall back on ad hoc responses because we think we should need to control the political narrative. In each case, what has happened is, in an attempt to try the political narrative, you have ended up actually by projecting a much worse narrative than if you had followed the drills which are already laid down. So these are some of the learnings that I came across. But that's just by way of a few opening remarks. What I will now do is to ask Commodore Uday Bhaskar, to talk about the context and anomalies of Kargil at 25. You have the floor. Yeah, sure. Okay. 20 minutes.
Thank you, Shyam sir. I think you have laid out some very important backdrop as far as the Kargil war is concerned. I'll try and take that forward. My brief sort of set of remarks, my remarks rather, would be framed on two issues, what I tried to develop as the context to the Kargil war and some of the anomalies of that war and what is it that we should be looking at in terms of the way ahead or lessons learned. So I'll build on what Mr. Shyam Saran has just said, that one of the most, of course, anomalous features of the 1999 Kargil war is that India and Pakistan were both states that had acquired their nuclear weapons just in the previous year. If you remember, May 1998, Prime Minister Vajpayee, the Shakti test, Pakistan followed suit. And in less than a year, of course, we had Kargil. And at that time, it was absolutely sui generis in terms of post-Cold War history. The Cold War ended in 1991. Kargil happened 8 years later. It was the first time that two countries with nuclear weapons, proximate neighbors, were actually engaged in the equivalent of a limited war over territoriality, which is why it led to a lot of anxiety in the global arena. And this is something that Prime Minister Vajpayee and his team had to deal with. This apart, there were other anomalies of that war, which are part of the immediate context. So I'll attempt to look at Kargil in terms of both the text of that war, if you will, as it happened, and the larger context, which is multi-layered. The immediate domestic political context to Kargil was the fact that Prime Minister Vajpayee, if you remember, was a caretaker Prime Minister, meaning that in April of that year, he had lost a vote of confidence, and he was there literally, as I said, waiting for the elections, and that is when Kargil was sprung on him. And when I look back now more as a student of security studies, Indian military history, to me it is quite extraordinary that a caretaker government with a brand new, freshly minted national security advisor, if you remember, Mr. Brijesh Mishra was India's first NSA. He was also the principal secretary to the Prime Minister. And he was dealing with, and I'm saying all this because he was very kind to share some of his experiences, if you will, in a closed-door session that Mr. K. Subramaniam had organized after Mr. Mishra demitted office. And as it happened, we used to do it here in the IIC. And Mr. Arun Singh was also there, and some very important, I would say, issues were brought up. And I'm trying to distill that to say that this, for the Vajpayee team, was an extraordinary challenge. And I'll just, say this in Twitter form, that the way in which they managed it, including the fact that Prime Minister Vajpayee was able to assure the global community that his aim was very, very limited, which is the eviction of the intruders. And that in many ways, I think, also defined the military kind of frame of reference, and which is why India had the kind of casualties that it did. But let me not belabor that point except to say that we had a domestic political context. We had a regional context, which was India-Pakistan at the first level. And we are all familiar with why and how General Musharraf at that time had embarked upon Kargil, which may have been tactically audacious, but it was strategically feckless, largely because of various other elements. But this was bilateral at level 1. The regional context also included China. And we must remember that China also played what I would call as a responsible role, if you will, as far as the Kargil war is concerned. And then there is a global context. So this is what I'm trying to draw attention to, say that Kargil was not just India-Pakistan. It had a larger context, and we need to ponder over some of the anomalous features of that particular war. And as we go on, I thought I would frame Kargil also in a larger temporal frame, or temporal spectrum, which is, if I could just use a little bit of, academic jargon, to say that there is a narrative about Kargil, a familiar narrative. For instance, the fact that we were surprised. And the Kargil Review Committee, headed by Mr. K. Subramaniam, put their report out in the public domain in a redacted version. And the title was Surprise to Reckoning. So the surprise element, that India was surprised. Again, Mr. Shyam Saran drew attention to the fact that India has been surprised many times. Then we had another book by the army chief at that time, General Ved Malik, and his was the first person account of somebody who was the army chief. His book is entitled Surprise to Victory. So that is the immediate kind of narrative that was being built about the Kargil war. Over the last 20 odd years, 25 years now, there is also a meta-narrative about the Kargil war. And how has this meta-narrative evolved? I would suggest that perhaps it is symbolized by that, ye dil mange more, Captain Batra. And the way in which the young soldier has been eulogized. The gallantry, the valor. As I said, we have officers here who led their battalions, one Bihar, first 11 Gorkhas, and many others. I'm only mentioning them because they're here. Their valor, their gallantry has been valorized, has been eulogized. But there is more to the narrative. And those are the questions I thought we should be looking at, again, conceptually in a larger bandwidth. To me, that larger bandwidth is 50 years of India's military experience, which I'd like to identify as roughly 1971, the Bangladesh War, an emphatic victory for India, to Galwan, 2020. That's about 49 years. If you look at that period, I was looking at some of the numbers. One statistic is the number of soldiers, number of personnel that India lost. I'll just read out some numbers. We're all familiar with Kargil. 527 brave hearts lost their lives, made the supreme sacrifice. We had more than 1,000 who were grievously injured, veterans of that war who were wounded. But if I look at this period, 1971 to 2020, Operation Blue Star, 1984. General Sundarji was involved in that. General Vaidya was the chief. Then we had 1987, IPKF, India and Sri Lanka. General Sundarji was the chief. 1999, Kargil. General Ved Malik was the chief. 2001, Parakram. General Padmanabhan was the chief. Then we go on. I've also included 2008 Mumbai, and I'll come to that in a moment, the terror attack on Mumbai. And finally, 2020 Galwan, when again, India was surprised. So I think this is one of the elements that at each time there have been lapses, intelligence lapses, inadequate intelligence, inability to assess, which has led to the kind of casualties that India had sustained. And the numbers are also very instructive. I spoke about 527 who had laid their lives down in Kargil. We had 83 in Blue Star who lost their lives. Op Pavan in Sri Lanka, the number of personnel killed were 1157, more than double of Kargil, but we hardly ever speak about Op Pavan and what happened there. Parakram, which happened after the attack on Parliament in December 2001, between 800 to 900 killed in that extended period when the Indian Army and the Indian military was forward deployed. So my question, or the issue I thought we should be looking at, is what is this recurring inadequacy in the larger lattice of India's defense management, higher security management, that each time we are surprised as a nation, and there is a fairly heavy human cost. And while we have the official narrative, semi-official narrative about Kargil, which is in the KRC, which the government has, in a way, allowed its release, and this is credit to the Vajpayee government, as Mr. Saran has pointed out. But subsequently, in 25 years, the official history of Kargil is still not in the public domain. We gather historians have been invited to write that particular history, but again, for reasons best known to the government, they have not been placed. And something as, to my mind, routine as a book by a former army chief, General Nirmal Vij, who was also the DGMO at that time, has been held back because there was some reference to the R&AW. So my question as an analyst, my question as a student, and particularly to the panel here and to General Nambiar, is that when we look at the war from a military dimension, that the number of soldiers we lost, could we have done better? And is there any reflection here on generalship, the highest levels of leadership in the Indian Army? And were there inadequacies there that we have perhaps not focused on? Because some of them have come into the public domain in a slightly unhappy manner. Some of you may be aware that in the last 2-3 months, there have been a number of disclosures, if you will, new information about the war. The one that caught my eye was a legal case filed by a former major against the army chief about a statement made about intelligence. Now, it's not my intention here to go into personalities, but to make the broader point that have we looked at generalship in a more objective way? And if so, is there something that can be shared in the public domain? I'll request General Nambiar, as I said, he's more qualified to talk about these issues and whether or not there is a need for a review assessment. I'll just share one bit that I heard in a seminar 2 weeks ago. General Nambiar was the chairman of the honors committee, as I said, for the Kargil war. And one of the officers there pointed out that when this awards were all made public, that the Batalic sector accounted for almost 40% of the awards. This is the numbers I read in the media. And yet, the commander of that particular brigade was not given a gallantry award. So these were seen as anomalies. So I'm just flagging them, sir, for your consideration. And in like fashion, I'm requesting Dulat sir, as our intelligence chief, to perhaps, sir, look at the current received wisdom is that there was an intelligence lapse and the R&AW had not provided the information at the right time to the army. This is one view. I know that in other seminars, people from the agencies have contested it. But my question to you, sir, is what do we need to do in terms of the whole intelligence domain, given the fact that each time we talk about India being surprised and an intelligence lapse? Despite the fact that we had the KRC, Kargil Review Committee, we had the group of ministers, we had 2 task forces on internal security and intelligence, headed by Mr. N.N. Vora and Mr. G.C. Saxena. Yet there have been no reforms. We've had 2 IB chiefs sitting as the NSA, Mr. M.K. Narayanan with Dr. Manmohan Singh, and now we have Mr. Ajit Doval. But no attempt for any kind of intelligence, even I would say, scrutiny, let alone review. So my question to Dulat Saab is, what is it about the Indian octopus, if you will, that does not, so tenaciously resist any kind of look at intelligence reforms? And the last issue is about, of course, the narrative of this war, as I said, the meta-narrative against which it is to be framed. And here again, as I said, there is one dominant stream, which is Dil Mange More, surprise to victory. But is there more to our military history? And the media, the way in which they have looked at this war from 99 to 2024, the adulation, are they capable of the kind of objective scrutiny? Do we have the competence, or is it that we have missing out some very important aspect of military history? There are eminent educationists here, academics. I thought we should deliberate on this, that apart from, as I said, we all salute the gallantry of our soldiers, but is there something more that we need to look at in terms of India's very complex military history? Because at the end of the day, I think everyone agrees on this, that we do not want another Kargil where another 527 lives are lost in this manner. Can we avoid that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Uday, for setting the stage for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating discussion. Let me just point out that you said, how is it that India gets surprised so many times? Most of the drills that I spoke about were precisely to deal with surprises. You will get surprised whether you like it or not. You can't, cater for each and every kind of eventuality. So I think one additional point that I would like to make is that there is, at least on paper, there is a drill laid down, very elaborate, to precisely deal with surprise situations. With respect to intelligence, of course, we will have some comments by both General Nambiar as well as Mr. Dulat. But also I would say that, there are multiple agencies involved. And the whole idea is that if one agency does not come up with the information, perhaps some other agency would. I think the conclusion that we drew was that what was lacking was not that there was no information flow, but there didn't seem to be one particular location where all this could be collected and a proper assessment could be made. I think various reforms have been put in place precisely for that kind of coordination. I don't know, frankly speaking, how well it is working, but I think the problem is we don't have a complete picture also with respect to what currently is the situation. Let me now turn to General Nambiar, who has great familiarity with how military operations are conducted, and with regard to the military issues, I'm sure that he has a lot to say. You have the floor, sir, and 10 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Shyam. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a privilege to be here with all of you at the India International Center on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the successful termination of the Kargil War. An occasion that needs to be commemorated in all solemnity, as much for the outstanding achievements of the junior leadership and men who participated in the Kargil War in 1999, as for the sacrifices many of them made in the process. I do believe it is also an occasion, particularly for our colleagues now in uniform, to remind themselves of the lessons that emerged from the Kargil War and place our national and military strategy, operational concepts, and organizational structures in perspective. Now, there can be very little difference of opinion about the fact that the operations conducted in the Kargil sector after the ingress by the Pakistani military came to light were an outstanding military achievement by the Indian Armed Forces junior leadership and the men they were privileged to lead into battle. Measured by any standards, national or international, to attack enemy-held positions at forbidding mountainous heights ranging from 15,000 to 18,000 feet, in many cases through hand-to-hand fighting, and restore the status quo along the line of control in the sector, was an achievement that I think will no doubt often be recalled when military tactics are reviewed and studied in institutions around the world. Success in evicting the Pakistani intrusion was achieved through great feats of bravery and commitment, aided, I dare say, in no small measure, by the most commendable performance of our gunners using the much maligned Bofors, and by our young air warriors once they were cleared to get into action. To answer Uday's question, with a couple of honorable exceptions, there was hardly any generalship involved. Nor was there any display of strategy or operational art, as it were. In that, we did not take the battle to the Pakistanis by hitting them hard in the depth area where it would have hurt them, or by opening up on other fronts, as was done by the then Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri in September 1965. It is all very well now to pretend to take satisfaction in the praise conferred on us by our self-styled well-wishers at the display of restraint, as it was. My own impressions over the years, in later years at least, has been that while, that's in view of the interactions and discussions that I've had at the international level, has been that while our interlocutors commended us at our faces for the restraint displayed, they actually did not think much of our capacity for political decision making, and assertive action in the pursuit of strategic objectives and national interests. The nation as a whole, therefore, owes a deep debt of gratitude to the gallant young officers and men who ensured victory against overwhelming odds. And I'm glad to see there are a couple of them here with us this evening. A victory that more or less signaled the end of India's international isolation following our nuclear tests and turned the Jammu and Kashmir issue on its head, as the inviolability of the line of control is now the mantra in international discourse on Jammu and Kashmir. Not a mean achievement, inasmuch as it had, together with the armed forces, Indian armed forces, similarly outstanding response to the tsunami disaster, also led to India's military capability having forged a niche for itself in global and regional security calculations. Therefore, for all the self-congratulatory postures adopted and plaudits claimed by sections of the political leadership and the diplomatic community for India's emerging stature on the global stage, in my view, the abiding truth is that the recent international recognition and acknowledgement of India's potential as an emerging regional power is firstly the outcome of the victory in Kargil, achieved by the Indian military, coupled with the tsunami response in 2004. And secondly, the country's economic growth propelled by our enterprising and determined entrepreneurs who stride the national and international stage. It is therefore only appropriate, I think, that on the anniversary of the Kargil War, we salute our gallant soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and more particularly those who made the supreme sacrifice for the nation. It may also be appropriate on this occasion to remind our political leadership, the civilian bureaucracy, our diplomatic colleagues, our colleagues in the corporate world, the ubiquitous media, and the public at large, that India's growth as a potential, or growth potential as a power of some significance, is contingent on its capacity to ensure its territorial integrity and the security of its people and its assets. Hence, maintenance of a credible military capability is imperative. Now, such a capability cannot be built on the procurement of weapons and equipment alone. It has to be anchored on human resources. The apolitical Indian armed forces that need to be respected and well cared for in times of peace. Peace ensured by the professionalism and credibility of a military that can effectively take on adversaries who no doubt wish to do everything possible to retard India's growth and emergence in the regional and global arena. Peace sustained by political and diplomatic processes that do not squander away the fruits of military victory achieved at great human and material costs. As we did, I think, in 1948, by going to the United Nations, when outright military victory in Jammu and Kashmir was within reach, and again at Shimla in 1972. And here, let me go back in time before returning to Kargil by taking a brief objective look. In the operations in Jammu and Kashmir in 1947-48, notwithstanding all the gallant actions by our troops, what we achieved was to push back the raiders and the Pakistani army that supported them. But finally, on 1st of January 1949, when the ceasefire came into effect, a little less than half of the state remained in Pakistani possession and remains so even today. Can we honestly call that a victory? I'll leave it to you. 1962 does not merit much mention except to make the point that contrary to what is often put out in the public domain, it was no trauma to guys of my generation. And I had 5 years commissioned service at that time. Because many of us are personally aware that despite questionable political leadership at the time, and in some cases senior military leadership, And being so poorly equipped, notwithstanding the odd aberration, our colleagues and the men under their command fought well and gave the Chinese a bloody nose. Reiterated subsequently at Nathula in 1967 and at Sundarong-Chu in 1987. The 1965 operations against Pakistan, in which incidentally I took part in the Sialkot sector, was also, in my view, somewhat of a stalemate. Because notwithstanding, again, great achievements like securing Hajipir and closing in on Lahore and Sialkot, we ultimately were back to square one after Tashkent. Insofar as Kargil is concerned, permit me to repeat that the performance of our young officers and men was absolutely outstanding in terms of recapturing the heights that the Pakistanis had encroached upon. No other army, I think, in the world would have undertaken what our young officers and men did. And I state this with some conviction, because as the head of the UN forces in the former Yugoslavia, I had the great privilege of having military personnel from about 34 countries of the world under my command. So I think I know what I'm talking about. I did my staff college in Australia as a young officer in 1968, when that country was at war in Vietnam. I was with a member of a training team in Iraq. I was military advisor at the High Commission of India in London. So I have been around the world and seen other armies. And therefore I say this, as I said, with some conviction. I'm reasonably better aware of capabilities across the world than many of my contemporaries are. So what I say is that. Now, even so, notwithstanding the fantastic efforts of our young colleagues, in actual fact, what we achieved was to recapture what we had held before the first week of May 1999. Now, I say this with some feeling because I do sincerely hope that our young colleagues in uniform sitting today in war rooms at various levels, evolving future strategies and drawing up operational plans, as also working on organizational restructuring, equipping parameters for the future, and so on, are doing so within a realistic perspective of what exactly our past operations were about, without being swayed by all the chest-thumping bluster and rhetoric that appear in the public domain. In that effort, the current senior military leadership, who were the mainstay of the achievements in Kargil, and obviously the ones to follow, will do well to recall what they were put through and ensure that at the training courses in various institutions and various exercises, studies, and analyses carried out at formation level, every effort is made to develop tactical concepts, operational art philosophies, and strategic doctrines, so that when the next round comes, no matter who the adversary, we give our young officers and men a better playing field than they were given in Kargil. Let us be quite clear. The 1971 operations in the Eastern Theatre have been the only real victory our armed forces have achieved since independence. In the Western Theatre, I think it was a well-executed replay of 1965. But in the Eastern Theatre, a new country was born. All Pakistani forces surrendered unconditionally. About 93,000 prisoners of war were in our custody. That these prisoners were repatriated without securing a permanent solution to the standoff with Pakistan is another matter altogether. It is unlikely that in the foreseeable future we will secure such a victory again. However, in the evolution of operational strategies and the proposed execution of operational plans, it is imperative that we factor in capacities that enable us to preempt our potential adversaries if we can, and or respond to an aggression in such a manner as to make him or them recoil and seek termination of hostilities on our terms. My plea to our colleagues in uniform, therefore, is do not put our youngsters through another Kargil-like situation. By more effective use of political, diplomatic and military options, make sure that unlike in Kargil, they are given at least an even chance in their efforts at dealing with the adversary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General Nambiar. And I would like to join you in really commending all the young officers and others who really put their lives on the line in order to protect the territorial integrity of our country in very, very difficult circumstances. Let me also just mention here, just to reinforce the point that you have made, that I had the occasion when I was doing border infrastructure surveys under the previous government to spend some time, about a couple of nights in Siachen. And the kind of conditions under which young officers had to actually survive those conditions for as much as 6 months. Psychological isolation, not just physical isolation. Again, I would say that we should not put them through those kind of conditions. So there is still perhaps a long way to go before we really address some of these issues. But you mentioned the Bangladesh war. The lessons that I draw from that war is that that was perhaps the first time where almost all the arms of government actually worked together as a coherent entity. And that is perhaps the most important lesson to learn from there. That since then, I don't think we have perhaps had a situation where we have had that kind of a coordinated, not just coordinated, but a collaborative effort amongst all different arms of government to really achieve a certain objective. And perhaps that is something that we should perhaps look at. Uday had mentioned the issue of intelligence. Again, there have been, he mentioned various points at which we have been surprised. Notwithstanding what I said about being prepared for surprises, there is an issue about intelligence and the very, very frequent failures of our being able to really have adequate information about what is happening. There is a view, sir, that maybe we are depending too much on technical sources of information. Perhaps the human intelligence part has become less in importance. I think there are many of your colleagues who would say that that's fatal. You must have human intelligence. Perhaps you can give us a sense of what has been, our perhaps shortcomings in that field, and what are the ways in which, in a very new situation that we are facing today, what should India be doing? You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Would you like to speak? You
Yeah,
can speak.
okay. I feel cramped.
Okay.
Mr. President, Commodore Saab, General Saab, my dear friend Sushant, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be here, let me first say. And thank you for inviting me, because I have not been invited to the IIC for a very long time. In fact, let me add that I have been invited to the BIC, which is the Bangalore International Center, more often than the IIC. But that's how Delhi is. In Delhi, everybody knows everything. And everybody is an expert. So you go out of Delhi, north, south, east, west, people want to listen to you. They want to hear you. Not in Delhi. Now, coming to this whole issue, let me start by saying what Mark Antony said, that I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. So I will bury intelligence here for the moment. I'll come to it. And I'll come to whatever you want to know. I spent 36 years in that business. But, and General Saab has said everything that's right, and I agree, and I would endorse, and I would go beyond that. I've always believed that our military is as good as any in the world, maybe better than any in the world. I would stand for that, and I have had umpteen friends in the army. Because I come from the Punjab, we've had so many relatives in the army. And there are generals all over who are very dear friends. So I don't want to go into generalship and into military history that General Saab has touched on, but let me take you back to Kargil and what I remember of Kargil. It's a long time ago. Also, I was in between jobs. I left the Intelligence Bureau. I joined the RNAW, but I was still an understudy, so I was doing nothing. And I was just watching Kargil from the sidelines like anybody else was watching. The first thing I can tell you about Kargil as a watcher, and what I saw was that it was a huge surprise to everybody. If anybody claims he knew what was happening in Kargil, I would say that's rubbish. Nobody knew. Now, again, General Saab spoke about the sacrifices of the army, the brave hearts, the Battle of Tiger Hill and this, that, and the other. And I think full marks to our young officers. On the 3rd of July, 1999, I happened to go up to those heights because I was in Srinagar. I asked the Chief Minister for his helicopter. I said, one has heard so much about the Kargil heights. Could I go up? And he said, take my helicopter and go. And I went up. I don't remember what the division was. General Saab would know. But I do remember the gentleman, General Mohinder Puri was there, commanding that division. And I had lunch with him in his bunker. And we had a good chat. And I said, how's the war going? He said, well, we're turning the tide, but it's going to take time. I said, how long? He said, possibly another month or so. I came back to Srinagar, and the next day, the war was over. Because what had happened in between, and here I have to just touch on intelligence. If you recall, there was a telephone call between Musharraf and Aziz Khan, which was intercepted by the RNAW. And my predecessor took it immediately to the Cabinet Committee on Security. He was so charged up. And the CCS decided that it will be made public. I was very much against it because that's not how intelligence men operate. But anyways, it was decided. It paid dividends. The message went to the Americans. And President Clinton summoned Nawaz Sharif and said, enough is enough, pull back your troops. That's how the war ended. That is the reality. So, on the question of intelligence, did we have any intelligence at that time? I'll tell you of a little thing. Now, this was intelligence. Mind you, that telephone call was intelligence, technical intelligence. I was in the IB, just before I left the IB, there was a report which appeared on my desk. It came from Ladakh, from Leh. And very rarely, I was then number 2 in the Intelligence Bureau, very rarely did reports from Leh come to me or anything. And I saw this report. There was something very unusual about that report because it clearly showed there was some unusual activity happening and some airstrips being built and that kind of thing. I said, this is not right, this is not correct. And I picked up that report and took it to the DIB. I said, have a look at this. He said, what is it? I said, it's not all right. So he said, you make out the report and send it to government. I said, I'll make out the report, but you will send it to government. This is an important report. It should go under the DIB's signature. And the DIB sent that report to the Union Home Minister, to the Union Defense Minister. At least I remember that. Who else it went to, I don't know. Because later, Mr. Subramaniam was to ask me a question, that why did you not send it to Secretary RNAW? I said, I don't know. I was not the DIB. But that report did go. What anybody made of that report, this thing. Now, the question which arises among intelligence people and the world at large is that there is talk about actionable intelligence. What is actionable? And to what extent can it be actionable? That I tell you, there's a terrorist hiding there, behind that bush or in that district or what? Or do I take you there and this thing? Then do I help you to shoot him? What is actionable? I still remember when I joined the Intelligence Bureau in March 1969, any bit of intelligence which came was welcome, even if there were little driblets, because there were officers on the desk to analyze those reports. Today, you were asking, sir, what are the shortcomings? Analysis has ended. Everything has to be instant, like Nescafe. Give it to us like that. So, and on the question of intelligence failure, I'll come to that in a moment, but this other thing which was mentioned, statistics, figures, drills, committees, these serve absolutely no purpose. They have served no purpose. These are only an eyewash. Those committee reports are just kept somewhere. It is for government this thing that, committee banao. What happened to the Kargil committee? What happened to those intelligence committees? What happened to the committees that Dr. Manmohan Singh set up for on Kashmir? Nothing. Nothing. And their committees keep on getting appointed. Nothing happens. Nothing will happen, sir. Nothing will happen on the bureaucratic level. You've got to think beyond that. You've got to feel beyond that, you know. And as I said, whatever I'm saying today, I left government or any attachment with government little over 20 years ago. So whatever I know today is what I know myself, you know, what I've learned. What I learned then, of course, a great deal, and what I've learned after that, because I've learned a whole lot after that. That's how those 4 books were produced. You referred to me as a rock star. I welcome that compliment, because today I live from day to day. And if somebody calls me a rock star, great. Why not? The thing is, and I don't know how to come to that, because, you know, there's so much happening all over the world. The world is going mad. But to keep it to ourselves, look at what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir today. You know, 2 months ago, I was at a conference, and I don't want to name names, and there was one of our senior officers. He said Kashmir is absolutely normal, full of tourists, so many people going on the gondola. When he said gondola, I said, when did you last visit Kashmir? Do you know Kashmir? Have you ever been to Kashmir? He was rattled. He said, 4 years ago. I bet he has never been to Kashmir. How many of our officers go to Kashmir? How many foreign secretaries, sir, have been to Kashmir? How many home secretaries have been to Kashmir? Who goes to Kashmir? People are frightened of Kashmir. You know, I can tell you that in my time, the first home secretary who went to Kashmir and who took a lot of interest in Kashmir and who welcomed and met Kashmiris in his office was Padmana Bhaiya. You know, he opened his door. But how many officers go to Kashmir? And you sit in your drawing rooms and this thing. My great friend Kamal Sibal talks about Kashmir. He's never been to Kashmir. He won't go to Kashmir. Why should he go to Kashmir? Either the military goes, or the paramilitary goes, or the intelligence buffoons go. So the point is that, okay, since this is a thing which will not go away, intelligence and intelligence failure. Just one other point, sir. You mentioned the CMG. And I must go back to the CMG again, because I was a part of a very crucial CMG. You remember the hijacking of 814? I was in the heart of that CMG. Nothing happened there. Nothing happened there. I'm telling you today. And many times I've been questioned by film producers, film directors, this, that, tell us what happened there. I said, how can I tell you what happened there? I can't tell you even today what happened there. But I can tell you that nothing happened there. Huh? Why did nothing happen there? And I will also tell you in that CMG, in those vital first 3-4 hours, before and after the plane landed in Amritsar, the CMG kept debating. The Home Minister came, the Principal Secretary and NSA came. Nobody decided anything. And as the President said, it's up to the Cabinet Secretary. But poor man, when there were bigger people around, who was to take this decision? And then we blamed the DG Punjab. He happened to be a batchmate of mine. And I spoke to Sarabjit later on. He said, we had the commanders there. But I was not going to risk my career and life. I was waiting for Delhi to give me orders. My Chief Minister, Prakash Singh Badal, had told me, I don't want bloodshed in Amritsar. Let it pass if it has to pass. But Delhi took no decision. And after the plane flew away from Amritsar, everybody blamed everybody. Now, was there an intelligence failure? Sure, there was an intelligence failure. Now I'll come to intelligence failure. Sir, if there were no intelligence failure, nothing in the world would go wrong. Be thankful for intelligence failure. Pearl Harbor would not have happened. 9/11 would not have happened. Trump would not nearly have lost his ear. That political head of Hamas would not have been killed in Tehran. And you can go on and on and on. And there are our own stories also. I mean, I'm not denying that. I mean, whether it's 26/11 or Kargil or whatever it is. Obviously, there's an intelligence failure. But remember, there is no such thing as foolproof security or foolproof intelligence nowhere in the world. And I would say, not because I spent 36 years or so in the business, but again I would say, just as we have the best military in the world, our intelligence services are as good as any in the world. And I have that from my friend across the border, Asad Durrani. In both the books that we have done together, he has conceded two very significant things. That you guys know Kashmir much better than we do, that the RNAW and the IB are much better than the ISI. Because you have professionals. In our business, people come and go. Yeah? And we serve short terms. So there is something to be said for professionalism, and intelligence services are not bad. But what is happening in Kashmir today? Just to divert you for a moment, Sushant was asking me while coming down, Kashmir mein kya ho raha hai? बहुत कुछ हो रहा है कश्मीर में. हम कहते हैं normalcy है. When it suits us, हम कहते हैं normalcy है. When it doesn't suit us, हम कहते हैं अब वो हमारा एक ex-DG कह रहा है पाकिस्तानी कमांडो आ गए. हजूर हमें मालूम ही नहीं क्या हो रहा है कश्मीर में. असली बात तो ये है. अब हमें क्यों नहीं मालूम है? अब फौज की बात करते हैं. 16 corps, 15 corps, 9 corps. You have 3 corps there in that area. Jammu, Pathankot, Srinagar. Today, all 3 are stuck. उधर मारो उधर जाएगा, उधर मारो इधर आएगा, इधर मारो उधर जाएगा. क्या इलाज क्या है? कोई सोचता है? फिर वो ये है कि उनके पास दे हैव मोर पावरफुल वेपन्स, इनके पास कम पावरफुल वेपन्स है, उनके पास ये है. ये फौज के सारे मामले नहीं है. देखिए, I would recommend those people, those who are fond of reading, I would recommend 2 books here. एक तो हम हिस्ट्री को भूल जाते हैं. एक E.H. Carr has written a book in which he says, what is history? History can be subjective, and he says very often history is subjective. But you can't change facts, na? Facts are facts. जो है वो तो है ना, उसको कैसे बदलिएगा? एक और किताब है, I would recommend very strongly to those who believe that there are other ways outside war also of settling matters. There is a book called, I've spent a lot of time with a gentleman, he lives in London. His name is Jonathan Paul, and he's written a book called Talking to Terrorists. Please read that book. Because the crux of that book is that insurgency nowhere in the world has been wiped out by force. It will not happen. It does not happen. That is one thing. So the other thing connected to that is, and that is something that our leaders on both sides acknowledge, that एक और छोटी सी बात मुझे याद आ रही है, that war is not what we want. So if you don't want war, then what is it that you want? Why are we not talking to Pakistan? Why don't we engage with Pakistan? Because, I'll tell you why. Our argument is terror and talks don't go together. There's some merit in that, yeah. कि भाई अगर आप बदतमीजी करोगे, अगर आप अंदर घुसोगे, हम कैसे बात करेंगे? ठीक है. And everything goes down, with a few exceptions. Vajpayee was an exception. Dr. Manmohan Singh was an exception. When everything is peaceful, when the ceasefire holds, why are we not talking? Why don't we talk? Then some Pathankot will happen, some Uri will happen. Something will happen. It's bound to happen. And let me say that it has taken the Pakistanis a very long time to forget 71. And remember, they haven't still totally forgotten it. There are still some generals there, hawks and hardliners, who have not forgotten 71. By and large, the intelligentsia among the generals say, forget 71. It's over. अब सवाल आता है, और ये सवाल आया था, just a minute, ये सवाल आया था कारगिल के उसमें. Was Nawaz Sharif in the loop or not? Now I'll tell you of 3 narratives I've heard, all 3 from Pakistan. He was not informed. Second is, he was informed but not totally informed, and his attention span is very little. Third is, he was in the know of everything, and he's even supposed to have remarked कि अगर हम श्रीनगर पहुंचेंगे तो मैं भी चलूँगा आपके साथ. मैं इसलिए ये कह रहा हूँ कि आज की तारीख में जो जम्मू कश्मीर में हो रहा है, I think is कि it's the Pakistan deep state. It is always the Pakistan deep state. But the politicians are always in the know of it. So if Shahbaz says today he doesn't know, he will always know. He'll always be told that we are doing this. This is going to happen. So that's how it is. My last word still would be, give it a thought. And this is what my friend, my contemporary from the Mossad said to me, Ephraim Halevi. He was head for 5.5 years. And he said there's no way to finish Hamas but to engage with Hamas. So if the Mossad can think that way, I think India can also think that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for sharing your very rich experience, not only in the intelligence field, but in many other fields with us, and some very, very wise comments that you have made. I think much to reflect upon. We are running a bit out of time, but I will ask Sushant to please tell us about Kargil and military history, but in a brief.
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Commodore Uday, Bhaskar, and Ambassador Shyam, Saran for inviting me. I wear many hats, but there are people wiser than me who have spoken on military and intelligence. So I'll speak as a journalist and as a lecturer. Firstly, I did not serve during the Kargil war, but many of my course-mates and closest friends served. Many of them made the supreme sacrifice, some of my closest friends and course-mates. So it's a very personal thing at one level for me. I did serve in Kargil a few years later. To begin with, the role of the media. The role of the media in 1999 during the Kargil war was a huge positive for the military, the armed forces in general, and the army in particular. And it also helped the ruling party or the government of the day in the way in which it operated. It was fantastic for the armed forces and for the government. But it was not that great for journalism, as we can now say in hindsight 25 years later, and also for Indian democracy and for the Indian society. You know, what it ended up breeding, and this is something which directly emanates from Kargil, is a very unhealthy sense of nationalism. Some of us may call it even toxic nationalism. And it also created a kind of a very intense militarism in the society, and essentially operating at a level of emotional manipulation, which we see a lot of media currently engaging in. So even now, 25 years later, over the last few weeks, what we have seen are only memories of Kargil. There is hardly any discussion about the lessons learned. I'm yet to see a great piece talking about the lessons learned from Kargil. There is a great bit about memories. So-and-so died capturing Tiger Hill. My coursemate Rajat Kari died, going up this thing. Great valor, bravery, fantastic. But where is the talk about all the lessons that should have been learned? If 25 years later we can't do this, then what's the point of journalism? What's the point of journalism? And it's not only true of journalism, it's true of other media stuff as well, whether it is films, popular culture, OTT, television series, your books, even non-fiction books. Most of the conversation is about memories. It's not about learning the right lessons. What I also saw both from my experiences within the army and as a journalist later on was that in some senses the army also learned some of the not the right kind of lessons in dealing with the media or managing the media. What started as the Army Liaison Cell during the Kargil War, eventually becoming the ADGPI, and then becoming the ADG Strategic Communication. It essentially became about managing public perceptions for the sake of the institution or the organization or the organizational leadership. And we have seen that effect since. Mr. Dulat spoke about Kashmir. On Kashmir, the kind of narrative that the army portrays, it almost makes these militants who are not really trained sound like 60-foot monsters. And you will have here every time there is a mistake that is made or every time there's a casualty, you will suddenly hear stories as if people are so well trained. They are SSG commandos. And we are seeing since 1991. We are hearing these stories, and these stories have not stopped. Whether it is about Eastern Ladakh, we see not a very truthful narrative about Manipur. And this is not about only recent events. If you go pre-2014, it's about demilitarization of Siachen. It is about removal of ops from Kashmir. It is about the China Strike Corps. A lot of this narrative has essentially come via the armed forces learning how to use the media. Some of us would call manipulating the media. But more dangerous lessons which were learned from Kargil both by the media and by the people who dealt with the media, was that a lot of mistakes were covered up. Enough books are now available, from memoirs, from after-action reports, which tell us that a lot of mistakes were made, but we do not want to talk about those mistakes. There is a tendency to hype the sacrifice. Every single sacrifice is hyped almost at the point of covering up something. The military was made synonymous with nationalism. That was never true for India. It's in 1999 onwards, you saw that the armed forces became completely synonymous with nationalism. And the armed forces were suddenly made to be beyond question, that you can't be questioned. And that is very dangerous. The armed forces deserve all the respect, all the honor, all the public adulation, but they cannot be beyond question, because otherwise the faults would never be brought out, they would never improve, they would never learn. To learn the lessons, they have to be questioned. They have to be questioned. And also the fusion of the military with the political ideology or the political idea or the political leadership throughout this time. This is not something which was nice. But something very nice happened also with the management of the media, and many people might not be aware. This is something told to me by Pakistani scholars who've interviewed Musharraf, that Musharraf's idea of freeing the Pakistani media and bringing the private media, or bringing the private television news channels in Pakistan, was directly linked to the force multiplier effect that Indian private news channels had in Kargil. Musharraf is on record telling many scholars this, that the idea came from this. He thought that the Indian private television news channels had acted as a force multiplier, and he needed to do that. The outcome of that, what we see now, is completely different. What he brought at that point in time. In Kargil also we saw something which worries me, the fact that this was the only time perhaps that the DGMO and the ACAS ops briefed the national executive of the then ruling party. It was not a great trend, and it is something for which nobody has been ticked off or punished since, because politicization of the military or the armed forces is something which really concerns us all. And you hear a lot of people talking about it, not from public fora, but in private conversation. Virtually everybody talks about it, everybody says about it. But this is something which should have been nipped in the bud at that point in time. You would also remember that there were election posters in which service chiefs' pictures were put by the ruling party. General Vidge notes in his memoirs that he had to walk up to the Prime Minister, write a letter saying this should be stopped. The service chiefs' pictures cannot be put on election posters for the elections of the ruling party. We saw that happen again after the surgical strikes, after the Balakot strikes. Now no service chief is writing or telling the government of the day not to put those posters. Kargil, many of you might have forgotten, was the first time that every single Indian soldier who died, his body went to his hometown. Before that, it never used to happen. Only few soldiers who died, their bodies used to come, whether it was in 67, whether it was in 62. Many of you might remember Hoshiar Singh's body coming down after 7 or 8 months, or maybe 2 years, and going to Jaipur. This was the first time that it happened, that all the bodies were taken to the hometown, and their last rites were conducted. Now, whatever may be the reason, of course, the obvious reason was humanitarian, but there was a political aspect to it. The manner in which this was done and the manner in which it was conducted, we have seen that continue thereafter. There are good parts to it, but there are larger parts to it which are more questionable and which should be brought under control. One of the other effects of Kargil, and I'm speaking in brief because I only have very little time because the time has to be there for question and answers, was also about the military's position in India as a custodian of nationalism. That's something which Kargil definitely did. And just to expand on this, Indian Army was not the PLA. It was not an army of the revolution. It was not an anti-colonial army. It was an army which worked with the colonial rulers, and then seamlessly moved with the rulers of independent India. The idea of nationalism moved between 1947 and 1999 from anti-colonial to territorial to a kind of a majoritarian nationalism. And the army actually became a custodian of that nationalism. So many of us who worry about how the army talks or army behaves should actually recognize that it is the nature of nationalism in India that has changed. And the army has become a custodian of nationalism over those last 25 years. Ambassador Shyam Saran spoke about reforms in national security and the K. Subramaniam report, the creation of the CDS, the intelligence reforms. In very brief, I think the conversation started during Kargil, but it was stalled, and the outcome was only half-hearted. It was too little, too late, and it continues to remain so in terms of reforms that have taken place in national security or in intelligence. Commodore Uday Bhaskar spoke about the official history of the Kargil War. The Defense Ministry did write the official history of the Kargil War. My very close friend Srinath Raghavan was asked to write the official history of the Kargil War, which he wrote and submitted around 7-8 years back. The army, of course, did not give him all the documents saying that they have contemporary relevance for their operations and therefore cannot be shared. But he did finish the military history, which has not been made public yet. A lot of people compare it to 62 or IPKF, but 62 was a loss. IPKF is not something the Indian Army is proud of. Kargil is something the Indian Army, the Indian government, and the Indian country, the country as a whole, is proud of. Why is the official history of Kargil War then not coming out? Why are those details not coming out? Because there are serious questions. If you look at the after-action reports which were brought out by Shami Vaveja in her book, there are questions about how ill-prepared the army was. General Vij in his book, which was about to come out, very clearly says that even after the war was over, the equipment and the ammunition had not come, for which emergency indents had been placed. There was major shortfalls at that point in time. The fact that we were not prepared adequately, which we should have been, is something which should have been highlighted. The brigade commanders wrote in their after-action reports that the army was too focused on counterinsurgency. It was not prepared for conventional warfare. After 10 to 12 years in Kashmir, it just did not know how to. The first few echelons did not know how to launch attacks on mountains. They're thinking they were chasing militants rather than going for conventional operations. It took people, my own course-mates, it took people 1 week to 2 weeks of actual reorientation and training to actually see how you will launch operations on this. So the initial battalions which went, suffered massive casualties. The operations only turned around by end of May. There has to be a conversation about it. We cannot just keep groping in the dark and keep everything. If we live in denial, we will be like the Pakistan army. Pakistan army suffers from this business of living in denial and talking about glory and not actually confronting the truth. We need to confront the truth, and Kargil is a good place to confront the truth rather than any other place. And the whole narrative which Ambassador Shyam Saran spoke of has been set in such a manner that whether it is Eastern Ladakh in 2020 or Balakot. Now the thing is that we don't want to talk about anything. There'll be no discussion in Parliament. There'll be no detailed media briefings. There'll be no white papers. There'll be no official reports. We just do not know what's going on. And now on top of that, we have books by service chiefs, whether it is General Vij, whether it is General Narwane, the former CISC, Lieutenant General Dua. Books are not being released. Books which have been published, the books which have been printed and are available for release are not being released. General Vij, as he rightly said in that interview, I retired 21 years back. What is it that I'm going to say which needs to be held back? Or General Narwane, who thinks that General Narwane is going to put out national secrets which he doesn't know are national secrets? I'm sure he's wise enough, if he has been a service chief, to know that he doesn't need to do that. Even on KRC, my only point is that KRC, while it was a great report, did great work, KRC stopped short because its mandate was only to examine before the operation started. Once the operation started, there's been no study for the operations and thereafter. Till date, I'm not aware of any study which has been done for operations and thereafter. So to conclude, my simple point is that Kargil war in 1999 should actually serve as a great clarificatory movement for everyone associated with national security. But it has essentially become a carpet or a wheel under which everything has been swept under under the wheel of valor and sacrifice of my friends and my course-mates and my colleagues, erstwhile colleagues in the army at that time. And that's not something which is healthy and should not have been done.
Thank you, Sushant, and I think you have made some very important points. One very key point I think you made is that we should not end up in a situation where any institution within this country, and particularly if we are a democracy, should be beyond scrutiny. So I think that's something which we are beginning to see, as if there are certain kind of offices, there are certain institutions which shall not be questioned. And I think that is completely alien to any kind of democratic functioning. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is about, you mentioned the kind of national fervor which gets generated, particularly when there are martyrs, I mean, people who have died in the service of the country. Surely there should be some recognition, but I think there should be some way of balancing that need with avoiding the kind of dimension that it sometimes takes. For example, it certainly pained me a great deal to see that when we had one of our very young officers who died recently, and there seemed to be a kind of a tussle between the parents and the wife, family, about how the spoils, in a sense, would be shared. Does that add any?
Can I say?
Yeah, sure.
So on the, this is another legacy of Kargil. Before Kargil, when you, as an officer or as a Jawan, as a soldier, you signed, once you got married, you signed 100% off to your NOK, which used to be your wife. Actually, Kargil, a lot of families treated the young wives very poorly, or wives, and I don't want to take a name, a very famous cosmet of mine, very glorified martyr, whose wife just walked away, and her parents suffered heavily with three sisters dependent on him. The army actually changed the rules thereafter, where you could actually nominate 20% of your insurance and all the other things that you were granted to your parents, and while 80% would go to your family, and that was done in this case as well. That was a legacy actually of Kargil.
Yeah. So I mean, what I'm saying is not the details like that, but what I'm saying is that surely the need, and I think the importance of recognizing the sacrifice of our soldiers is something that is quite legitimate. But how can we perhaps do that without this kind of crassness which seems to have also entered into this whole business? So thank you very much, and I think we have now time for some questions, and I will ask my friend Uday to please conduct the question and answer session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I thought that we'll recognize, first of all, some of the Kargil veterans who are here. So if Brigadier Yadav or Asthana, you all want to say something, we will give you the floor first, and then I'll recognize the others. OP? Yeah. Brigadier Yadav, just introduce yourself. There's a mic there.
Good evening, everybody.
जोर से बोलना, OP.
Good evening, everybody. I am Brigadier O.P. Yadav. I commanded 1st Bihar during Kargil operations. I do not know why the history of the Kargil war has not been written, but I am quite clear the history of my battalion I know right from the day the unit was inducted into the war till the operation ended. Now, there was a point regarding surprise. The army itself has the internal drills how not to get surprised. Any defensive formation commanded by a brigade commander or a divisional commander or a corps commander will always have a contingency plan. You can't ignore when the gaps are very wide in the defenses, you always expect somebody will attack or somebody will occupy these features. Then contingency plans are always made at every level. In this case, I did not find the contingency, because for contingency, troops are earmarked. If this thing happens, so and so will move and do this. There are formations which have dual role. They do the insurgency as well as some other. That kind of contingency plan was not there. I was part of 8 Mountain Division, and 56 Brigade. Brigade Amarol was my brigade commander. I was deployed in the counterinsurgency area. From there, I received the orders on 15th of May. The detection was on 3rd May, but I received the order on 15th of May that something has happened in Daraz and there is a requirement of a unit to move. Prior to my unit, one Naga is the first unit which moved on 13th. And then the whole brigade was told to move. The brigade had 1st Naga, 1st Bihar and 18 grenadiers. So 56 brigade was the first one to move on 15th. 16th we reached Daraz and we came under the artillery fire. That is where Brigadier Surinder briefed us, that look, some militants are sitting on top of these hills and people are a little scared, they don't want to go, those kind of things. And I am telling you, I had the full battalion strength. My battalion was I had the strength of over 600 people. Generally, any unit which is, at any one point of time, 25% people are on leave and remaining battalion. So I was fairly, well equipped. And second issue was that since we were deployed in the counter-insurgency operations, where only your rifles and LMG are used, other equipments are mothballed and kept in the courts. And since these inputs were also insurgency-related inputs, that some militants are there, we were carrying our 15 kg jacket and patkas, everything, and we were pushed into that. Then the orders were received, okay, the situation in the battalion is also equally bad. So I was told that you have to move to battalion and report to Brigadier Devinder Singh under 70 Brigade. That was far tougher terrain. The situation was really bad in the sense that we were operating in the CI operations at 5,000 feet, and here we came to 15,000 feet and above. Acclimatization was hardly any. Therefore, that was the main reason of suffering the initial casualties. The very beginning, I was inducted in 70 Brigade on 20th, 21st morning I reached, and first attack was launched. Initially, I was told to coordinate the attack of 2 units, which was also not fair. I told the brigade commander, how do you ask me to coordinate the attack of 3 Punjab and 111 GR? One company of 111 GR was given to me, and as a CO, and both the COs were present. On my left was 3 Punjab, on my right was 111 GR. I was sent to, contain Jubar Ridge. I said, sir, I have come today, I must brief my unit, because the commanding officer must brief the unit what is the task ahead and how will they do it. It is a very, very important part. That opportunity was not given because probably they were thinking they were militants and it should get over within no time. So therefore, the initial casualties were suffered. We went with that aim, and my first attack with my battalion was launched on 27th of May. And 29th, I suffered 1 officer casualty. It was the first one, Major M. Sarvanan, and 4 other ranks. And then the pressure was that you retrieve the bodies. I said, sir, he's having the regular troops and the defenses are coordinated. We'll suffer further casualties. Let me capture Jubar first, which was a higher position. And don't worry, I will be able to retrieve these bodies later. So finally, I had to capture Jubar, and I had to tell these senior officers, sir, I am not here to write condolence letters to the families. I am a commanding officer. I am responsible for the safety as well. And then I said, okay, leave it to me. Then I could identify that things are different. What they are telling, that these are militants, they are not, they are regular troops. And then I finally captured Jubar, recovered these bodies, of course, after 40 days. So these were the reasons of suffering the casualty. No information about the objective, and we were really surprised. These gaps were not well covered. There was no contingency plan.
Thank you, OP. I'm sorry I have to curtail this because lots of very rich detail, from you having been there in the spot. Now I'll take 2-3 questions at one time, and again, as always, I'll request you. One question, please be brief so that we can put them together, and I'll get 111 GR later. Is that okay, Brigadier Asthana? So that we have our other participants here. Okay, can I start with Dawar? Please identify yourself for purposes of recording, and then I'll come to Mr. Gupta.
I'm
Ask your
Praveen
question.
Dawar. I'm not a Kargil veteran, but I'm a 71 veteran. Now, my question is, there was accountability in the 62 war. The defense minister was sacked, the chief of army staff was sacked. Why was there no accountability in the Kargil war? And before you answer this, I want to tell General Nambiar that I don't agree at all with him what he said about the political leadership in 47, 48, and 62. We haven't had a more courageous Prime Minister than Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. I would like to say that. Thank you.
Dawar, just give the phone to Praveen, to Mr. Gupta.
My name is Ashwini Gupta. I am a retired officer of State Bank of India, currently freelancing in different fields.
Hold
My
it close.
question, slowly.
Yeah, closer to you.
My question is about the public domain related topics. A lot of speakers mentioned that things are not being discussed in the open. Things are being hidden. There is unnecessary secrecy. So my question is, can we have a rule like England where after 30 years, many classified documents are released?
We have that rule.
In India? I don't know. That's all.
Yes.
You'll get an answer.
So, okay, sir. Okay. So, and...
I mean, may not always be followed, but there is a rule.
okay. So, and one more question. Can we popularize the army as a career? Because after all, what determines everything, intelligence gathering or operations, is the caliber of our soldiers. And it is in colleges that we have to select the right talent. So we should popularize the army as a career among college students. Thank you.
Pradeep Gupta, पीछे, उनको phone देना, and I'll come this side in a minute. And then we'll get responses.
Yes, sir. I'm Pradeep Gupta, who has served in MOD as well as MHA. And the day I joined in 2001 in MOD from the ordnance factories, I was given this Kargil Review Committee, and thereafter bigger avatar, that GM on National Reform Security. Probably that was not mentioned much in this discussion, but the panel discussion is very enlightening, I would say. So in the GOM national security, national reforms on the security structure had profound impact in the MHA and MOD. You see, Department of Border Management was created, NTRO came out of it, so many other actions were taken, and still it is being done. So if you see, follow the files, every month or two, some reference comes about these institutions, this committee, especially the GM report. And there is a checklist also, we keep on following it. So this is one that the profound impact, what Mr. Shyam Saran has rightly mentioned, that the impact spotlight of the Kargil is still there in the echelon which are involved in implementation of those decisions. Second thing, what Brigadier Yadav has rightly told, that mentioned that it was basically initially interpreted as a insurgent, some militant coming from that side and then doing some of these operations. Kargil was not declared as a war. This I came to know when I handled the Parakram in 2001 end, December. Then we went into details. We found that the Kargil was not a war because the war was not declared as per the procedures. I was handling the Union War Book also then. And it was a notified operations, so a lot of advantages didn't go with it. But then nevertheless, government was well aware and they gave it to them in due time, the then NDA government gave.
Thank you.
So this is just I wanted to set. So the GOM report itself is being implemented, that follow-up is still there, but maybe that we are not as understanding those things. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So I'll request a response. You want to give him the 30-year wala to Mr. Gupta?
No, what I was saying was that there is a rule that 30 years files should become available for use by scholars or researchers. But there is also there are two problems. One is most of these files also need to be reviewed so that something which is really very, very sensitive does not get into a public domain. May not be very many, but there are some files like that. Now, for that particular review, you need people to do the review. Now, if say the territorial head in the Ministry of External Affairs, he's such a busy person, for him to actually sit down and do the review is very, very difficult. So, as a result of that, there is a time lag. And secondly, there are, in fact, it is much easier for people to just say this is too sensitive to be made public. So a lot of the files which I've seen files which certainly do not qualify for being so sensitive, but they have been marked as sensitive. Because nobody wants to sit down and actually, it's much easier to just say that it is a sensitive material, so it should not go. So that's unfortunate, but that's the case.
Sushant, you want to take on the army? Can it be popularized? You want to?
No, army, the army as a career, can it be popularized? Yes, of course it can be popularized, but I think the social mores over a period of time have changed dramatically, and to expect that the society would behave differently when it comes to the army vis-a-vis other career choices that are available is unlikely. So the army used to be a career in which people, Commodore AJ is there. There used to be people, Captain AJ is there. People used to be there. People used to come over many generations, and now, of course, when you talk to senior military officers, you realize that very few people are coming from military back, at least from second generation, third generation, fourth generation officers are no longer coming. I think it's a change in society. While it can be popularized, it will be a tough one in the times that we live in.
But since you raised that question, Mr. Gupta, there's a very interesting sociological indicator, which I had read in some other context, that in India, when families are looking for husbands for their young daughters, and they put out the so-called feelers, I gather that the armed forces are at the bottom of the, shall we say, pecking order for a variety of reasons. But this is an empirical observation, but I think I won't digress just now. Let me identify Mr. Bagai, Mr. Dudeja, and Commodore Rai in that order. My request, again, all of you are seasoned IIC veterans, just keep it as a question. Mike Imko Dera, Mr. Bagai, and then Dudeja, and then Ranjit Saab.
Yeah, no background in the army.
Bagai, hold it closer in 1 minute.
Yeah, you're talking about lack of protective equipment. For one thing, could the aircraft have been used earlier? Was there a delay during the Kargil operation? That would have saved a lot. And secondly, somebody mentioned that China behaved very responsibly during the Kargil war. Now, in the case of terrorism that Pakistan is doing all the time, is Chinese not discouraging it because it hurts themselves also?
What, Chinese what?
Are they discouraging Pakistan from terrorism? Are they behaving responsibly?
ठीक है, Bagai साहब बैठ जाओ. Mr. Dudeja, just 1 minute for you, huh? Yeah.
Sir, regarding intelligence, we are trying to forget the inputs from villagers of that area. I think we should appreciate their contribution. And same time in China border, now they're putting so many villages in that side and our side that there's no such villaging facility available. And we are using the NASA inputs from most of the time, which you have to pay heavy price for it. Why not to have your own ISRO input so that we can have a intelligence input? And second thing, sir, General, sir, we have laid down so many brave heart in recent Kargil and other. In future, we are having a so-called Agnivir. Do you think in happening something, the Agnivir will also same brave heart?
Thank you. Will Agniveers become brave hearts? Will Agniveers become brave hearts? Ranjit Rai, Commodore, here.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. To an audience like this, hints are enough to say what happened. The first point is, I think, on historical. I'm not an army man, but I was lucky to be DNI and DNO, and it goes into your blood. When you open the newspaper, you're always looking at it, and Shri Dulat is a good friend, a neighbor, a very senior, and every time he walks, I ask him 3-4 intelligence questions, and if he denies that. So let me talk about intelligence. This country was brought up for intelligence to look after the British. This army was brought up to look after the British. That is in our blood. Therefore, it was in my blood when I was DNI to ensure that what the chief wanted, I would partly give. I suffered a bit when you went too honest. So, Sushant, you're absolutely right. The biggest disaster was the IPKF. I was there with the army ops room every night. Nobody wants the answer. So, Mr. Dulat wants the truth. A book by General A.J. Singh, A.K. Singh or something for IB. That book has still not been cleared. 2 books have not been cleared. I was lucky, my book was sent back to me, and I'm putting that book back again. So intelligence. The second point on history. Mr. Dulat, you're absolutely right. That telephone call between General Musharraf and China, and if you don't want to know anything, India always, Indian Navy, Army, there is a side loop in any telephone. Today, of course, internet, telephone, everything can be monitored. As you saw, they have hit They have hit in Tehran a building with accuracy, knowing that somebody was just there 2 hours ago in a meeting with the president of Iran. So that is the technology today. You're right, whoever spoke, it was not a war, it was half war. Today, the definition of war, Russia has said it's not gone to war. It has not gone to war, it has gone for special operations. So I've converted history. The Indian Navy, Eastern Fleet and Western Fleet were put all around the Makran coast and Karachi. On 4th of July, the National Day of United States of America, Prime Minister Vajpayee was invited, Nawaz Sharif was invited. Prime Minister Vajpayee did not go. Nawaz Sharif went there. Besides being the National Day, in the Oval Office, President Clinton invited Nawaz Sharif. And you can quote me. He told him that the Indian Navy is all around you. If you don't withdraw and they blockade you, I will not be able to help you with oil. You will not have a drop of oil. And remember history, oil brings in victory, Second World War.
Ranjit sir, thank you.
And last point is very, very important to me. So how many people you have lost? I'm understanding now why the army does not want Agniveer. When you mentioned that sailor or that Jawan and 20%, you don't want Agniveer because you have lost so many people because they were so loyal to your MLI. If you go into the Agni scheme, you may not be able to do a Kargil again.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, well, just a second. If you take 1 minute, I'll get you on board. Okay, but you will be the last. Just identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Love Puri, and I'm a columnist on peace and security issues for the last 20 years, and I come from Jammu and Kashmir. I'll be very brief. This disconnect that exists between the ground and the policy making here. Dulat uncle talked about, what's happening in Jammu right now in Kashmir. There's a scramble. Like, you talk to mid-level officers there, intelligence bureau or any security apparatus, they don't have a clue what is happening. The things have repeated in the past, but where's the institutional memory? Like, why don't we have those institutions right on the ground so that the officers who are on the ground in all these national security theaters, they take advantage of that? Why don't they exist? Maybe there's a need for reforms of, in terms of institutions that exist in the border areas. They need to be strengthened so that we give good information to our army personnel and other elements of the security apparatus to do what is required. Thank you.
Okay, I've got you, Mr. Puri. Mani sir, we can't say no to you. So, we cannot say no to you, so you'll be the last word. You have a mic here. Mic यहाँ देना मणि शंकर साहब को.
Thank you for saying yes to me. A very pointed question to Mr. Dulat. Was the establishment, the entire establishment, so mesmerized in January, February of 1999 by Vajpayee's forthcoming visit to Pakistan that they deliberately did not listen to the intelligence that came in between the autumn and the winter of 1998 that indicated that things were going very wrong. As far as I know, the Subramaniam Committee has referred to a number of incidents that were actually reported, but I think George Fernandez did not want to look into all that because it might spoil what was to be the most historic visit ever undertaken by an Indian Prime Minister to Pakistan. And as a result of not looking into it, when Kargil came, it was a surprise to the political establishment, but those who were on the spot knew that it was about to come. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, what I will do now in the interest of time is to make sure that everybody gets a chance to respond. We'll go in the following order and short responses. I'll request Mr. Dulat to go first on Mr. Manishankar's question. And you can take one. General Nambiar on Agniveers. I'll request Mr. Saran to talk on the China factor. And, okay, you can concluding remarks.
Yeah. So the deployment of IF, somebody asked why the Indian Air Force was deployed much later. Jaswant Singh in his memoirs very clearly said that the political impact of an aircraft going down is much more of a soldier dying. In every CCS meeting, he vetoed the use of the Indian Air Force when it was asked for. The use of Air Force was only approved in a CCS meeting when Jaswant Singh was in Germany. And George Fernandez actually calls him and tells him that we approved the use of the Air Force when you are not here, but I want to tell you that it has been approved. Even then he did not agree to it. He vetoed it because he believed that, and as you remember, one helicopter and one aircraft was shot down, and he believed it had a major impact on national morale. That was the delay, why it was a delay in the
Dulat sir, to Mr. Manishankar's question regarding did the establishment play it down?
Sir, I started by saying that now you put it more specifically, January, February. I was in no man's land. I left the bureau on the 13th of Jan, and I just about joined the RNAW. So I really don't know what was happening at that point of time. But I don't think much was happening then. When I look back, I don't think much was happening. So, but to answer your question, I don't have the answer. There is one or two other things which have been raised. Sushant spoke about the politicization of the military. There's another connected matter, and I know Ved Malik mentioned this some time ago, that how long will we keep using the army for counterinsurgency work? Is that what it's meant for? I mean, we have the paramilitary, we have the BSF, we have this thing. And I can only say that I think overuse of the military is, of the army for counterinsurgency is not a very healthy practice. And it's good for nobody. So, because I would say that still, even in Kashmir, despite all these years, the army is still held in high esteem. So why do we want that name to also get rugged? And coming to Kashmir, ultimately you can have whatever you want to have, but unless you have the JK police with you, nothing is going to work.
Thank you. General Nambiar, on the Agniveer, sir.
I don't know what one can say about the Agniveer. Ranjit, you and someone else raised this. I think it's too premature, presumptuous, in fact, on my part to try and comment now. If you are around 5 years hence and I'm around 5 years hence, maybe we can raise the issue and talk about it. It's too early to talk about this, whether it's working or not. Firstly, we hardly are privy to much of the detail, except what appears in the media. And that's hardly a thing to go by. So I would suggest reserve your, doubts and things, and we'll see how things go. Give it a chance. You haven't got any other option anyway. I mean, it's already being implemented.
Thank you, sir. I'll just add one line to what Mr. Manishankar asked about what happened in the autumn and winter of '98, were they carried away by the Vajpayee visit. I can only share some remarks made by Mr. George Fernandez as the defense minister after he had demitted office, and this was part of the exercise that Mr. Subramaniam had encouraged us to do here in the IIC. And the summary is that Mr. Fernandez was not informed by the army about many of the references made by the KRC in that early part about what led up to. So this much I can state for your consideration. And why the army did not inform the political leadership, I think, is a whole, a subject that merits a more detailed discussion, because there are many views. There is a Jaswant Singh view, there is a Brijesh Mishra view, there is George Fernandez view, and I have not had chance to speak to Mr. Advani, but I gather that as members of the CCS, it's interesting when I studied this, the triangulation, there's some missing links, but at another time, sir. Shyam sir, I'll request you to conclude and perhaps talk about the China, 2 references to China. and the villages and the terrorism, if you want to.
What was the reference?
That, China is now building the villages, and they did support terrorism, Pakistani terrorism against India.
So I'll just come to that. I'm very happy to hear that some of the GOM recommendations are actually being implemented. If they are being implemented, then it would be very nice if the rest of the country was told that these are the reforms being made, which is a little... I'll give you an example. I mean, a number of recommendations were made, for example, with the team that I was doing border management surveys, several recommendations were made. I'm told that many of those recommendations have been implemented, but I have no idea. So that is something which I think it would be very reassuring for us to know. Yeah.
So one question on my part before you conclude. The Brigadier, I forgot the veteran.
Oh, sorry. Okay, please.
Asthana, if you want. Mic le aana inko. Brigadier Asthana of the Gorkhas. Mic le lo.
Yeah, thank you. So before we talk about First 11 Gorkhas and Batalik, I think it's just a question which I should have asked Ab initio, that what will be the outcome of this exercise that we are going to do here, sir? That is something very important to me, sir. Now coming to First 11, we were the first ones inducted into the now practically forgotten Batalik sector. Only General Nambiar has done justice to our sector by giving 40% of the battle honors to that sector, I mean to the battalions that were there. We were the first ones to be inducted from Siachen on to Batalik, fought on for about 80 days. I will only say one thing, despite all the challenges, about 60 days down the battle, we were down with, loose motions, vomiting, etc. because of gunpowder water that we were drinking. We were down from 250 to about 36. And that is when somebody mentioned about that aircraft. We had seen, back in May that an aircraft had been shot down by a post in front. We could see the Stinger going and it had downed the aircraft. So when at the end of around 60 days when we were fighting, we had completed our task, which was given to us. But our men said, Sahab, tyo post capture karno, we must capture that post, because that is from where the Stinger was fired. Despite all the challenges, they had only one thing in mind, that we have to capture that post. And with those 36 men, we went and captured, and those pictures are there of the Stinger. We got the officer who had fired the Stinger. Why we know that he is fired? Because we captured his handwritten diary in English. And it says, today we shot down an Indian MiG. And thereafter we went on for the next 20 days. We came down on 26th of July. It was very fortunate that we could plant the Indian tricolor at Tekri on the line of control. And then we came down. So it was about a 90 days engagement in Batalik.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Just to reinforce the point made by Sushant, that the Kargil is actually presented as a great victory for the Pakistanis. And if you remember, there were publicized medal giving and award giving to various Pakistani officers and soldiers. In fact, they dropped the pretense that these were militants and were actually giving awards to Pakistani soldiers. And all of them, by the way, I saw several of them, all of them claiming that this was one of the great victories won by the Pakistani army. So narrative does count. Let me just say that, question has been asked, what will be the result of this? The whole idea of having this kind of interaction is that government is not everything. I think it is important for there to be public awareness. There is importance of this kind of a public discourse, a public debate. And hopefully, as I said, it was reassuring to know that actually several of the recommendations which have been made are actually being implemented. So perhaps whatever has come out of this is also going to be taken back to the government so that perhaps some change will come about. But even if that was not, I don't think we have to write down and make recommendations. I think those who need to know what recommendations are here. By the way, all that has been discussed here is not rocket science. So it's not as if I think we have come out with some brilliant new recommendations. I think we know what needs to be done. And we know what is wrong. I think, again, the question always becomes, even knowing that, what are we prepared to do about it? So I will on the China question, of course, China is an adversary. So you should expect that China will, exploit every vulnerability, every weakness that you have. And I think this again goes back to what I mentioned about the border infrastructure. That one of the reasons why we have been vulnerable is because our infrastructure is not good enough compared to what you see on the other side. Even after we have made huge, improvements in our border infrastructure, they have gone still further ahead. So that asymmetry is there, that asymmetry is a reality. And somehow we have to have a strategy how to deal with that asymmetry. That's the problem. With regard to villages on the border, by the way, after 62, we had villages on our border. The government of India did put in large amount of money to settle ex-servicemen along the Arunachal border. And when I went several years ago to doing the border infrastructure survey, I found that all those villages were empty. There were empty houses, empty villages. Why? Because most of them had, the government's support program did not continue, or maybe the food subsidy was not there, or because, their children's education could not be taken care of. So virtually all the villages were empty. So, there is also the issue of, one, there is a quick ad hoc response, and then slowly the interest starts coming down. Complacency sets in. So that's a big problem dealing with a country like China, where there is I'm afraid there is a continuity of effort which does not seem to be always matched on our side. I mean, that's just a general comment. I would only like to say from all the very, very interesting points that have emerged this evening, that again, the main issue seems to be not that we don't have knowledge of the gaps there are, or we don't know what to do about filling those gaps, but there is a certain, shall I say, a political culture of, shall I say, keeping all options open until those options are no longer there. Ultimately, this is what happens, that if you try to keep all options open, because there may be a political price to be paid if I do this, so why take that risk? Or if I do this, there might be a problem politically, so let's not do that. Ultimately, what happens is that if you don't take those risks and you don't take those decisions are taken for you. But they are taken by somebody else. So this is something which I think we have to recognize, that ultimately it's a question of how much of a political will there is in fact to improve the national security. And that is why something like a national security doctrine, a national security strategy becomes so important, so it's really something which is indispensable to my mind. And it's very unfortunate that every effort that has been made to actually come up with a national security strategy, at the end of the day, the government has backed off and doesn't want it to be, either made public or discipline itself to the kind of, compulsions which such a security should have. So hopefully, that kind of ad hocism that we have in our national security setup I hope that that is something that we can get over in the none too distant future. Thank you very much for your attention, all of you who have come here. First of all, I would like to thank you, and then to thank each and every one of our panelists who have really given us, a very frank and open, comment about the challenges that we have been facing and how we can perhaps try to overcome those challenges. And lastly, but not the least, I would like to thank Commodore Uday Bhaskar for taking the initiative to bring us together here to not only reflect upon the lessons of Kargil, but hopefully to see if there is a way possible in the future to deal with some of these challenges. Thank you very much for your attention, and good night.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Big thanks to the IIC program team, by the way. I don't know where Tete is, but she and her colleagues, Tete is there. Thank you very much. Big hand.
And next time Mr. Dulat is asked to come to IIC, there will not be such a gap, I promise you.
That's as long as you're there.
Main dining. Main dining.
Thank you very much.
Level 1. Main dining. Level 1. Okay.